Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to our program. We are doing a series, and this is part 3 of that series, celebrating humor and music. Conversations with comedians and musicians from the past. And for our viewers who might not have been with us in some years that we've done this, we're using something called the Chautauqua format, and we get professors and very gifted people to study a famous person's history and portray them on this program, as they also do a symposium at North Idaho College. And so today, in our Chautauqua format, we're going to be role-playing, and we invite to the program John Lennon, who lived from 1940 until 1980 when he was tragically killed. And he was a 20th century English rock and roll songwriter and singer who, as you all know, gained worldwide fame as the founder of the Beatles. And along with another member of the Beatles, Paul McCartney, they formed the very successful Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. Mr. Lennon, welcome to 2007 in our time, and we look forward to the interview.
Thank you, Tony.
And as always, I'm pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and she will commence today's questioning.
Welcome to today's program, Mr. Lennon. As a musician myself, I've always been fascinated with your abilities, with your talents, with the Beatles as a whole. So tell us, how did the Beatles get together?
Well, it started with a music called skiffle, which was very popular in England. A guy named Lonnie Donegan had a hit with a song called Rock Island Line. And the great thing about skiffle was you didn't have to be able to play an instrument. And I didn't really play an instrument. So, I got some friends together, Pete Shotton, Nigel Whaley, Colin Hanton, and he played drums. And eventually I was able to convince my Auntie Mimi to buy me a guitar, which she thought was a terrible idea, but I managed to do it. And my mom showed me how to play the guitar like a banjo, because she played banjo. So I had to learn banjo chords on the guitar. And so that's what we started out with, was this group of guys who really didn't know how to play. And a friend of mine named Ivan Vaughn introduced me to Paul McCartney during one of our shows. Paul was really good. He knew how to play, and he was into rock and roll the same way I was. And I thought, well, he'd be great for the band. But then if I asked him to join, he could be challenging me because I was the leader. Nobody was as strong as I was in the group. But I knew that it would make the group better. So I invited Paul to join, and he joined. He ended up talking me into letting George Harrison join, because George was 3 or 4 years younger than me, and I didn't want to have anything to do with him. He sort of tagged around, and it wasn't any fun. It was like the younger brother, get him out of here, But eventually Paul did convince me to let him join, and once the 3 of them were there, we became more serious. That idea of, well, you're going to have this group, but you don't really have to be able to play your instruments. It wasn't good enough anymore. So the others sort of trailed off. I got my friend Stuart Sutcliffe. He did a painting in a contest. He was a very talented painter, Stu. And I was able to convince him to buy a bass, because we needed a bass player. Now, he couldn't play, but that didn't stop me or him. And so he joined. He tended to play with his back to the audience because he couldn't play and didn't want anybody to catch him, you see. And we got a series of drummers, and sometimes we didn't have drummers, and we weren't considered that great a band. We were called the Quarrymen at that time. We got a gig being a backing band for a guy named Johnny Gentle. We called ourselves the Silver Beatles at that point. And then we got the chance to go to Hamburg. And when we got to Hamburg, we actually became a really good band. And we dropped the silver, and we became the Beatles. And Stu stayed in Hamburg at that point, and Paul had to take up the bass because we sort of made him. And we had gotten a drummer named Pete Best at that point. And then when we got the recording contract, the producer said he didn't like Pete's drumming. And we played with Ringo in Hamburg. He played with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, you see. And we had played with Ringo a few times on some of our last visits to Hamburg, and we really noticed that when we were drumming when he was drumming for us, we had a great sound. And so there was, the minute George Martin said, look, Pete Best isn't really a strong enough drummer, we're going to bring somebody in the studio anyway, we thought, well, let's get Ringo because he was good. If you want that kind of drumming, he's not the best technical drummer, but if you want that kind of drumming, Ringo's the guy you got to have. And so he was our guy.
And did you already have your trademark Beatle look at that point?
Not until Hamburg, actually. We went over there, we were in our leather and our, teddy boy haircuts, with the ducktail, the Elvis kind of thing. And we fell in with a group of kids. They were called Exies. They were into existentialism, and particularly a guy named Klaus Vormann and his girlfriend Astrid Kircher, who she and Stu ended up being together, actually. But Astrid she ended up cutting our hair, and we had noticed this over in Europe, this haircut. And so I can't remember which one of us tried it first, whether it was George or Paul. Maybe, but once one of us did something, we all just jumped in, So I think it was Paul and me that started it, and then the rest of us got our hair cut the same way. And when we got back to England, we kept it, and everybody started liking that, So that's how the haircut happened.
Thank you, Mr. Lennon.
Oftentimes, Mr. Lennon, Americans today look at the success, and even young people today, they know all about the Beatles, and the music still goes.
Oh, that's good.
And so, it's good for you to know that in our time in 2007. But many people think that you four found one another at the very beginning, and it was magic at the beginning. And so you've indicated that there was a search until you found the right persons in magic. But another thing that you did, this particularly was something you were very gifted at, along with Paul McCartney, and that is, some people may not know that you were songwriters, and that a lot of your music that you did write it yourself.
Well, Tony, that's a story. Yes, Paul and I started writing songs, and Paul was actually a songwriter when he met me. He had written a few songs, and he was impressed with. I always forget lyrics. You see. The Beatles show got so tight and so regimented that I ended up learning those lyrics because we did the same 10 songs night after night.
Yes.
I Want to Hold Your Head and all those. But Paul was writing songs already, and I would tend to make up lyrics. And so he saw that I could make up lyrics. And then Paul showed me that he was writing songs, and I thought, wow, you can do that, And so Paul and I got together day after day, hour after hour, and we started writing. Just like mad, filling up notebook after notebook. Oftentimes, we were in Paul's house while his dad was at work. And so friends would hang out, and he and I would just play eyeball to eyeball, writing songs. And when we became famous and we'd be going on tours on the road, we wrote songs, in the back of vans and the back of buses. A lot of the early hits, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, we were just nose to nose playing those things.
I want to do two parts of this. First part is identify for our viewers some of the most famous Beatles songs that either you or Paul were the songwriters.
Where one of us sort of wrote it more on our own.
Okay.
Or where because we had a lot that we wrote together. In fact, a lot of them, Paul would have a lot of his finished, and then I'd help him finish it off, and he'd have a lot of his finished, and I'd help him finish it off. But some things like Strawberry Fields were something I did on Almeria, Spain, when I was shooting How I Won the War with Richard Lester. And so that was a song. By the time we get to the White Album, a lot of the songs, we were starting to write a lot of them just on our own by then. So whoever's the singer is probably the principal writer. So Strawberry Fields Forever, I Am the Walrus, is something, Come Together. Those are songs that I wrote mostly. Paul did things like Yesterday. That was totally his baby. It's a beautiful song, wonderful, and I don't wish I'd written it. But it's a great song. Obla Di Obla Da is one of Paul's. Hey Jude is one of Paul's.
That's a great one.
Yeah, and that's also an example of how Paul could be a really great lyricist. I think probably lyrics are my strength over Paul's, but Paul shows in some of those songs like Hey Jude that he's a very good lyricist. He just sometimes gets lazy, but I didn't have any hand in the lyrics for Hey Jude, and they're wonderful lyrics, So those are some examples. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it certainly does. And then, of course, it's always, no, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time, at some point down the road, when there's a group such as this, they break up, and that happened with the Beatles. And you went on your own, and you found a new wife, and you found new creativity. Give us a couple of examples of things you did on your own after the Beatles broke up.
Well, probably some of the most famous things was Yoko and I we decided to use our celebrity as a commercial for peace.
Right.
We were hearing the commercials for war every night on television with the news about the war and people being maimed and napalmed and all that. And we thought, well, let's use our celebrity as a commercial for peace. And we wanted to be sort of the jokers, the clown princes of peace. So we'd do things like bed-ins and shave our hair and appear in bags, trying to be kind of fun, have some fun with it. But, it's important to be for something. When you're against something, the anti gives a lot of power, today, of course, for me, today is, 79 and 80. The anti-nuclear movement gives a lot of power to the nuclear people because of their anti-nuclear. You give a lot of power to the war people by being anti-war. You want to be for peace. So that's what we wanted to do. So that was something that was fairly famous. We did those. And then albums, I was really proud of the Plastic Ono Band album. Not everybody liked it, but it was... I thought it was very different from what I did, and I thought some of those songs easily stand up to what the Beatles did. And my song Imagine, I was very proud of. If I was only going to be remembered for one song, that would probably be the one that I'd want people to remember me for. And the Imagine album I was real happy with. And of course, I'm very excited about the Double Fantasy album that we have out now, Yoko and me, because her songs are on it and they're great fun, and I'm hoping people get a chance to appreciate her.
Well, after your death, Imagine has continued to be magic itself. It's really very popular.
Oh, I'm good. I'm glad to hear that.
Janelle Burke.
John Lennon, there were probably a number of people who were influential in your life. Who would you say had the most influence over you? And let's do some different times. Let's say growing up, who was the biggest influence, and then the period of the Beatles, and then the period after the Beatles, if you will, after the group breaks up, so to speak. Can you name those people who were most influential in your life?
Well, I was always different, so I always found myself not wanting to be following anybody. But of course, my Auntie Mimi and Uncle George, who raised me, were a great influence. My mum was a great influence, although I didn't live with her and I didn't get to see her much during my childhood. When I was 5 years old, my dad left, and my mum sent me to my Auntie Mimi's. So Auntie Mimi and Uncle George were a great influence in my childhood, and they took real good care of me. When I started listening to the radio, what really influenced me was rock and roll and Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran and Buddy Holly and those guys, Chuck Berry. And when I heard Elvis, that was the end. He was great, but the problem with Elvis, it was Elvis. So I always like to think that Chuck Berry was my teacher and Elvis was my idol. So Chuck Berry was another great influence. So musically, I had some very strong influences there. When we got to be, the Beatles, the Fab Four, it was just trying to keep up. We had schedules. In a way, Brian Epstein was the person who had the greatest influence because he had our schedules and we hardly ever got a day off. So that was, so Paul and I and George and Ringo, we were all in this tight little box and there was no chance to have a life of your own, so it was really different.
But you did marry.
I did marry.
And you had a son.
I had a son. I didn't really end up being much of a father to him, though, because at the time, the thing is that I was dating Cynthia, and she ended up getting pregnant, and it wasn't really our plan, But then a lot of kids are born out of a whiskey bottle on Saturday night, and I was one of them, and Julian was one of them, and I've explained that to him. But I didn't really want to be married, and then, of course, I'd go on tour, and I'd go to Australia, and I'd come back, and there'd be a whole different kid there, Was that really Julian, because it had been months since I'd seen him. So I wasn't really much of a father at the time, and I was having a hard time with that because then I was living out in the stockbroker belt and getting kind of depressed about the whole thing, feeling trapped about here we can only do, we can't really be a great rock and roll band, we're making these records and we can't go out to the store or go to a restaurant or go to a movie or any of that sort of thing. So in a way, Beatlemania became this huge influence, that's right. And then I went to a couple of daddies. Brian was sort of one of my daddies. Arthur Janoff became a daddy for a while with this primal scream therapy. But Yoko became one of my great teachers. And ultimately, she ended up helping me find myself and find out who I was and giving me the confidence to. My ego had been totally destroyed by about 66 or 67. I hardly had any ego left, partially because of, using LSD, which destroys your ego. And then being in Beatlemania and being this married father that I wasn't ready to be. I really didn't have any ego at all, and it was Yoko who started building me back up. So without Yoko, I don't know what would have happened to me. So she was a great influence, and a very positive one. Despite what all the naysayers might say, she was great for me. And so those were probably some of my greatest influences.
How much were drugs an influence at some point in your life?
Well, I was self-medicating. I call it my Fat Elvis period, because I was drinking a lot in 65, 66. I was drinking a lot, taking a fair amount of, there was LSD, there was pot, there was speed. We discovered speed early on, in Hamburg and even in Liverpool. To keep the long hours, you'd get these little pills that you'd take, So that was really part of the scene anyway. But and I don't really advocate for them anymore. But they were fun, but they weren't necessarily good for us.
But they were a part of some of your music.
Oh yeah, yeah. There were songs. Some of the Sgt. Pepper stuff wouldn't have been done without it. Certainly that period of 66, 67. Then I got, Yoko and I were both on heroin, which was a terrible thing. If you look at Let It Be, I'm sort of a zombie through some of the film because I had to go through rehab halfway through the sessions, and then I started being able to contribute. So that put me at a standstill for a while. So on the one hand, some of them helped us write and be creative, and on the other hand, they took away your creativity. And at a certain point, you have to say, well, I'm a songwriter, and I want to be able to write songs, and I can't keep doing this artificial thing. So I have to find out how to do things just on my own,
In your presentation at North Dakota College on the Chautauqua format, you indicated today that be careful what you wish for, and that wishing is very powerful, and the mind is very powerful, and you may, in the end, wish that you'd have gone a different route. And I'm leading up to a question. I recall that when if I believe I'm correct, on your first visit to the United States, you get off the plane, and it's just maddening. That is, that you're just inundated with people, and you're on the Ed Sullivan Show, I believe, was the first appearance. And from that moment on, your life was not your own worldwide. But share a little bit with us what you meant this morning about that created also problems for you and the others. You were extremely wealthy and making worlds of money and very famous. And so many young people around the world would have loved to have been one of the Beatles, but that was not all glory, was it?
No, not really. Again, that's why I sort of went into that Fat Elvis period, as I call it, because we lost touch with our audience in a lot of ways. When we were at the Cavern or we were in Hamburg, we'd talk to the people who were in the audience, and we could, we'd sleep on stage, we'd be throwing up on stage, we'd be swearing on stage, we'd be talking, somebody would go into the Cavern and, there'd be somebody saying, hey, John, would you play Sweet Little 16 for, Pat and Margie, And so we had this contact with the audience that all of a sudden you couldn't do. And you'd get into these big places where you're playing with amplifiers the size of a peanut, and it's this rock and roll showcase, and it's really not a rock and roll show. So you're all of a sudden insulated. And you couldn't go to the store, you couldn't go to the movies. We could go to a club called the Ad Lib, where they kept other people out, but then again, we were all in there with Mick and Keith, and Donovan. So you were there with a bunch of other rock and rollers, So we lost touch with the audience, and you don't have control of your life, So it was very depressing. We couldn't play the music sometimes that we wanted to play. Our life was all on this schedule, and so it was one of those things where what we wished for was other people's versions of what success is supposed to look like, and we got it,
But you
and we
lost
realized
all
it was
your
a trap.
humanity.
We did. We lost some of the humanity. But thank God there was four of us. Because without Paul and George and Ringo, we saw what happened with Elvis, right? Mm-hmm. So the four of us we helped each other out and helped each other through the period. Nobody else knows what it was like going through that, but at least we had the four of us. But it was very hard. And stopping the touring really helped. But then, what if you're a rock and roll band? If you're not touring, what do you do then? So that it was really a very difficult time in some ways, and we were the only place we could really be a group and be creative was in the recording studio.
That you use your talents. One final question before going back to Janelle. From when you started out and you were talking about the small clubs and where you had the contact with the audience and all, I assume that your relationship with one another was much better, and near the end, as you broke up, were the relationships between the four of you much more difficult?
It got tense, yes. It's got to. Anytime you're in a marriage, you're breaking up, and it was a marriage, and in fact, I even told Paul, I want a divorce, and we got on each other's nerves. We get along great now, but we don't have to see each other very often. But John, Paul, George, and Ringo will continue forever, but not as the Beatles. We're not those same people. But when we went through that period, it was very difficult. But I was totally into Yoko, and so my attention was on her, and they were kind of jealous, which I can understand now. At the time, it hurt my feelings, and it was frustrating. But if I would have been one of those guys, I would have felt the same way if Paul had fallen in love or George had fallen in love and they were going off doing their own thing. So, yeah, we were getting on each other's nerves, and the sort of things that had been getting on your nerves for years that you didn't really notice, all of a sudden you noticed, and, I've had enough of that, and I'm saying that to him, and he said that to me, and I've had enough. And everybody quit at one point or another. Ringo walked out while we were doing the White Album. George quit while we were doing the sessions for Let It Be. I had quit before we even finished Abbey Road, but everybody said, no, be quiet, about it, because Alan Klein is negotiating with Capitol, and so you're gonna get a better royalty, and it's gonna hurt the negotiation. So I stayed quiet. And then when Paul put out his solo album, then he announced it, and he was the only one who hadn't quit.
That was most interesting, Janelle Burke.
Would you please describe for me how you saw each one of you in terms of your personalities? I think when people hear the Beatles, they automatically think of John Lennon. So you may be a headliner, so to speak. But what was your position?
Well, it was my group, after all.
That's what I was going to ask. Were you the dominant personality? And then how did each one of the others fit into this group? Because there had to be some magic there with the four of you. It wasn't just four people who saw each other as in one way or another, but it had to be some magic. So can you explain a little bit how the four of you worked together and what your personalities were?
Well, it was my group. I started it. I okayed anybody who came into it. So in the early days, it was definitely I was the leader. And then, during that 65, 66, 67 period, I became less dominant. I wasn't writing as many songs, and Paul started taking over, and he was the one who had the ideas and kept things going. And so that dynamic changed, although I was still kind of the leader. And then when I came back, it was sort of a tussle, because Paul would say, well, let's go into the recording studio next week. I've got some songs, and I hadn't written any. And so I had to fight to get my songs on our own albums, But Paul and I were also the dominant pair because we were the songwriters. And George was writing some songs, but he didn't get to record as many of them, really, because a lot of them just weren't up to scratch, But Paul and I had so many. So Paul and I were always fighting for space. And Ringo was, he was just happy to be coming along, He was, I think any one of us would have gotten famous on our own, though. I mean, Ringo was already the drummer who was in demand in Liverpool, and then now he's proven himself as an actor and as a musician. He'd be famous no matter what. Paul would be famous no matter what. George probably would be famous. He's such a good guitar player. He'd be, he and Paul went to all kinds of sessions, and George in particular. But Paul and I were the dominant ones, and it was really our group. And who knows, if we had a couple of other people, whether we still would have been as popular or not, but Paul and I were the center of it. And I started off as the leader, and then when Paul started trying to take over, that created more tension, really, especially when I came back and woke up.
Well, you do have complex music in many ways, and what you were writing was very creative. Now, at some point in time, you decided that you wanted to live in the United States as opposed to living in England. What made you decide that?
well, I could walk around, I could go into New York. New York reminded me of Liverpool in the early days. Not because it looked like it or had the same atmosphere, but I could walk around. I could actually, walk down the sidewalk and people say, "Hi, John, how's the new record?" Or now, they say, "How's the baby?" Of course, now that they're asking about the record too, because we've got a new record out, Double Fantasy. But I really liked that you could walk around there. And people had told me, Mick Jagger had said, you go to New York, you can actually live a little bit. And we can go to a restaurant, Can you imagine how great that is, going to a restaurant, going to a movie, So that was what attracted me to America.
And this baby you're talking about is?
Sean.
And that's your baby with?
With Yoko, yeah, which they said we couldn't have, because there were doctors had said, well, there's, you've abused yourself too much. There's something wrong with your sperm because you were this rock and roller and abused yourself with drugs and sex. And we went to this Chinese acupuncturist who said, you can have baby. You have baby. You stop eat. You eat right. You stop using drugs. You have baby. And we did all that.
Being here, the clock always wins. We do want to go out of character for a moment, and I'll let you talk for a minute. I want to introduce to you Joe Jacoby, a great friend and a colleague at North Idaho College and the faculty. He really directs the theater department at North Idaho College and has great plays. And Joe, we thank you so much, and I appreciate you choosing this. Did you enjoy doing the character?
I did, but I was petrified because John Lennon is, if you just do it even okay, it's not necessarily going to be good enough because he's somebody who's inspired so many people.
When we talked, you said, I'll choose John Lennon. And our viewers who are out there who were not in the auditorium this morning, I can testify to the fact that when you finished, you lectured and then you did some music, and you had a large crowd. You had a standing ovation, so that speaks for itself. So you did accomplish a marvelous performance, and I know there are a lot of hours and days go into those preparation, and we really appreciate what you did, and it's great having you as a colleague.
Well, thank you very much. Likewise, Tony.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join us again next week, and we're going to move to part 4 of this really exciting Chautauqua format of celebrating humor and music. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.